Welcome and hello to this afternoon's or morning, depending on where you are, webinar on the musical works and licensing standards that DDEX has developed over the years. The webinar should be taking about an hour, depending on how fast we get through the material and depending on how many questions and how many issues you may want to raise. I will be talking briefly about DDEX itself, giving a little overview of what DDEX is, why DDEX is, and how it develops these standards. And then I want to talk about the musical work licensing standards that we have developed. It's 3 standards for one overall choreography, and I will be talking about those, specifically the message structures as well as the choreography, who sends what to whom, when. I'd like you to ask questions. The more questions, the better, I would suggest. If you could do that using the chat function, that would be appreciated. This is the first series of webinars about the DDEX standards that we've been having over the summer. This is the first one that deals with the work licensing standards, and we hope obviously that you find it informative, and if you have any feedback, if you could provide that to us, that would be lovely. And as I said, if you have any questions during the webinar today, please use the chat facility. I'll try to answer all the questions. I will, and I have recorded or have started to record this session, so you will be able to go back over the material covered, look at the slides again and all of those things. We will send out a link to where you can find the recording one of these days, in a couple of days. Certainly not today. As I said, it's a series of webinars that we're doing over the summer. This is the third, or there are 2 more webinars scheduled, one for the 17th of September, one for the 24th of September. You can see the ones on the screen there. We're planning to have more of them, but we don't know when there will be at this stage. So what is DDEX? DDEX is a standard setting organization, and we're trying to make the value chain, the communication along the value chain, more efficient. We do that by standardizing 3 aspects of this communication. The biggest aspect is the format. What fields, what data elements need to be communicated in which communication? How should that be formatted, and how do the individual elements relate to each other? The second aspect is, when does each of those messages need to be sent? That's the choreographies. What are the triggers? Who sends it to whom? What is the expected response? And last but not least, we're dealing with a protocol. How are the bits actually being communicated? Quite essential as well. DDEX itself is an open, not-for-profit membership organization. We've got about 130 members from the entire value chain, musical works companies, whether they're rights owners or administrators, people who own sound recording rights or administer these, and then digital music retailers, technology service providers, DSPs as we call them, and then more and more companies and individuals from the studio environment where the music is actually being provided and made. And we've got 3 membership tiers that I just wanted to briefly mention. Full members, they're the bulk of our membership. They come to all our meetings, or allowed to come to all our meetings. They are the ones that provide the input to our technical work. They decide how the standards are being developed, what goes into a standard, what doesn't go into a standard, and how things go into a standard. You see the revenue-based membership fee structure listed on the screen. The other 2 membership tiers, charter members, they basically do the same as full members, but they can nominate somebody to be on the board, have a significantly higher membership fee, and there's a limited list of companies that can be charter members. And then we have associate members. It's for companies and individuals who don't have the bandwidth to actively participate in the work. They do get access to the documents, but they can't really attend all the meetings. Primarily, they can't do that anyway because they don't have the bandwidth. And that's as significantly cheaper than the charter members. And if you want to see who's on the members list, yeah, you can have a look at DDEX.net. Now, DDEX has developed standards over the years, and we've developed quite a number of those. There are 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 or 10 different families of standards, I've never really counted them, that we have developed. Starting from release deliveries, that's what when a record company sends the stuff that they want consumers to listen to, send them to DSPs. Binaries, how are they communicated? We have a standard for it. There is sales and usage reporting. There is information that is going to and amongst music licensing companies. They are administrators of rights for record companies and for performers. We have sales reporting and claiming for ownership of musical works and sound recordings. So the accounting basically. There's a standard that deals with providing and establishing and communicating links between works and recordings. And there are standards that deal with musical works notification, musical works licensing. And those are the standards that I want to talk about today. So it's where record companies, DSPs, authors' rights societies, and music publishers come together, so rights holders for musical works, and then the DSPs and record companies who want to use works administered or owned by those publishers or authors' rights societies. So we'll be talking about that today. But before I go there, let me just highlight one aspect, which I think some people say it's the biggest achievement of DDEX in the first place. And that's what's underpinning all of our standards. It's quite critical that we have a common nomenclature that everybody uses when you want to exchange information. If you have two computers that want to talk to each other, you need to make sure that the semantics of the information that they exchange is well known to both machines, or rather the teams that program both of those machines. And DDEX achieves that by providing a data dictionary which provides the semantics of all the terms we use, as well as the structure of common composites. And it's this DDEX data dictionary that provides, as some people call, a lingua franca for basically the music industry when it comes to exchanging information. And some companies even use part of the DDEX data dictionary to develop their own internal systems as part of take inspiration from it, because it provides a decent data model for most aspects of the music industry. Anyway, let's talk about musical work licensing. And before we go into the actual standards themselves, I think it is worth to note that there are two principal approaches to work licensing. One is what I would call work-by-work licenses. That's where somebody who wants to use a work, a record company, for example, wants to license a musical work or wants to record a musical work, or an artist for that record company wants to record a work. And there is, of course, the need for a license in that case. And that can be done work by work, where you request a specific license for that specific work that has been or is to be used, and then you get a license, and then you are allowed to do that. The alternative approach, which traditionally has been used much more in Europe, is the blanket approach, where there is a blanket license being provided by a licensor, if there's an agreement between licensee and licensor, and where all the information about what has actually been used follows as part of the sales and usage reporting. But the work by work information, you already know which works are being used. On the blanket license, you then need to get that information once you have people sending in sales and usage reports. Today, we are just dealing with the work by work cases because that's the standards that we have developed with specific focus on the US market. Because let's be honest, the US market, the processes were rather archaic in places, and a lot of efficiency could be added by providing some automated messaging to it. And that is what we have provided. Now, if you want to do work by work licensing, you basically need to go through 3 stages. I want to make a recording. I need to first identify who are the owners of the works that I want to record. In the blanket case, I don't need to do that because I have a blanket license. All the works are being licensed through typically a collective rights management organization. But in the works by works licensing process, I need to identify the owners of the works. Once I know who owns part of the works that I want to record, I can then request and obtain licenses. And then I can happily make the recording and start trading the music that I have recorded. I still need to do some financial accounting at the end, but I am now licensed. In some cases, there may be compulsory licenses already in place, but still I would need to identify the owners of the works first before I can establish whether I have a license already in place. But musical works are being traded. So there is still a need to maintain the licenses, for example, if the catalogs of those musical works change hands. If one music publisher sells or sublicenses a catalog to another publisher, in that case, whomever has taken out the license needs to know that now there is someone else to pay for that license. The license will typically stay in place, but somebody else now takes over the accounting and receives the money. And DDEX has developed 3 standards for these 3 purposes. There is the Musical Work Rights Share Notification Choreography Standard, the US Musical Work Licensing Choreography Standard, and the US Letters of Direction Choreography Standard, MWN, MWL, and LOD. The first of those 3 standards, MWN, is not that specific to the US. That's a standard that can be used pretty much anywhere to communicate who owns what share in what musical work. The other 2 standards, while not exclusively for the United States, the standards have been created with those requirements in mind, and therefore we're not 100% sure that they work in other countries. Therefore, for the time being, we call them US Musical Work Licensing Choreography Standard. That may change over time when we learn more of other requirements or if those standards are actually being used elsewhere. The current status of those standards is that MWN was originally published in 2016. The current version is version 1.2.1. So we issued version 1, obviously, and it was then updated twice with minor updates. They weren't big, and the standard is in use today. MWL was published earlier this year. The current version is 1.0.1. There was a small bug in version 1. The implementations are well underway, and there may actually be active users as we speak. I do not have current information. And last but not least, the LOD standard was just recently published. Current version is 1.0. And yeah, I don't think there are any implementations at this stage, but that is not really surprising. There are test implementations, but not live implementations at this stage because the standard is only a couple of months old. All of these standards are what we call candidate standards. A candidate standard is basically a fully fledged, ready to implement standard. However, we don't have yet collected sufficient implementation experience to say that the standard is fully is a full DDEX standard. We don't expect any big issues because we've tested it, but the formal operating agreement that under which DDEX operates says that first the standard, it becomes a candidate standard before it has been tested. And in this case, before this cycle of MWN, MWL, and LOD has been tested before we can actually call it a DDEX standard. And since LOD is so fresh, we're simply not ready there. And I will, of course, talk a little bit more about these three standards in a moment. There's a question from Kevin. Are these standards specific to publishing and mechanicals? They are certainly specific to publishing in the sense that they deal with musical works. So the things that music publishers own, control, and govern. But it's not just mechanicals. It's equally performing, at least from the standard. It's all the kinds of rights that that musical works can be put to: mechanical, performing, printing. All of those rights can all be dealt with by the standard. But going into these standards, before going that, I think that it's worth looking at the elephant in the room, which is the MLC, the Mechanical Licensing Collective, which has been established by the US Music Modernization Act, which was signed into law a couple of years ago. Now, the MLC, which has been established earlier this year as a commercial entity and has been chosen by I think it was the US Copyright Office who chose, has selected one of the companies as running the MMA Mechanical Licensing Collective. They have certain communication needs. They need to be able to communicate in bulk work and recording metadata, and they need to be able to receive sales and usage information from people who have used those works. And they have publicly stated, and I can vouch that that is true, that they're working with and through DDEX to develop those standards. And there are two standards. One we call the BWARM standard, the bulk communication of work and recording metadata. And the other one is the digital sales reporting message feed standard, which is an established and very widely used standard already. And there were a couple of small edits and changes that were necessary to satisfy the requirements of the MLC and its business partners. So we are in the process of looking at the requirements that the MLC has expressed, as well as their business partners, because amongst our membership, we have both the MLC itself as well as a number of their business partners. But we can't finalize anything really because there are still some metadata issues open and they're subject to ruling by the US Copyright Office. And we're waiting for that ruling. Once that ruling is there, I'm pretty sure that DDEX will fairly quickly finalize those two standards, the BWARM standard and potentially an update to the DSR standard, so that by the beginning of next year, when the MLC is meant or is legally required to be operational, that will happen. I'm confident, subject to the US Copyright Office providing their ruling in time, that we will be able to do this. Unfortunately, I don't have much more to report on that subject to you today because it's still drafts. Both of those things are still drafts. Well, DSR is not a draft anymore, but whatever may need to be added to the standard, that is still draft and half-baked, if you like. I hope that makes sense. So let's talk about MWN, and let's talk about the choreography that happens there. And it's a choreography between a label or a DSP and a publisher. And it's simply that the DSP can send a claim request to a publisher. You can then recall them or update them, so there's a little bit of flexibility built into the standard itself, based on which the publisher can then send a share claim message back. Of course, those share claims can be updated. It's critical to note that there is no central database of all the licenses, all the work shares who may own something. That's not part of the standard. It's simply a messaging standard that allows a label or a DSP to ask a publisher, hey, you publisher, can you please tell me what you own with respect to this song? It's not just publisher, it can be other licensors, it can be collective management organizations on behalf of publishers as well. There is no, it's not that narrow, but it's to a specific individual entity. And really critical to note is the core concept of this message, and frankly, the three standards that I'm talking about today. That's the right share. That's the little bit of right that a company owns or controls for a specific territory. So which work is owned, in what percentage, in which territory, at which time, for which right, in which use type, and so forth. Those are the core entities that the MWN, MWL, and LOD standards communicate about. The standard also works, however, through a hub. There is one hub developed at the stage by Sound Exchange, for example, and labels and DSPs can then ask that hub to basically provide services to reach out to all those many publishers who then can provide their claims, either using the MWN message themselves or using a web interface for the small mom and pop publishers that do not have the capability of developing an XML-based message exchange system. And therefore make the life for both label, DSP, as well as publisher much easier. I have to, Heber asked whether these share claims sync with YouTube's asset share claims as well. To the extent that the core entity that YouTube works on, that's an assumption. I don't know for sure, but I'm fairly sure. Those are right shares as well. So yes, when YouTube talks about an asset share claim, there are two different bits, I guess, one needs to talk about. One is the rights in the sound recording, which is what YouTube calls an asset, and the rights in the musical works. This only deals with the musical work portion, but on that level, yes, YouTube would also deal with right shares as everybody else. I hope that answers that question at least partly. So this is how the messages, the two core messages, there are a couple of additional messages in the standard itself, and we can have a look at that in a moment. But on the left-hand side, you have the request message. Hey, please, can you tell me what you own as on a specific musical work? And on the right-hand side, you see the answer to it. So both messages look comparatively similar, don't they? And that is by design. All of those messages look very similar to this because they all provide the same core data with different commercial data overlapping. So all of them have a message header that says who sends a message to whom when. They all have a list of the parties that are involved. And parties, that's not everybody having a glass of champagne. Parties for us are writers, are recording artists, are publishers, are companies that are involved in trading music, trading rights, having rights. So it's all the people and companies involved. You then have the works that are being listed. If you want to ask for a share picture from a publisher, you need to tell them which work is involved. And for each work, you then have the usual metadata that you can provide, identifier, title, the writers, which are then parties, and other aspects as well. You then can provide, and that's optional though, in which resources that work is used. If you know it's a work and it's been used in this sound recording, well, that may help the publisher identify the work quicker. Therefore, you can provide that information, as well as the release list, where in which products and which albums is that resource, which then contains the musical work. That again may help the publisher or the collective rights management organization to quicker understand and map and find the work in question. And then you have a request list that basically asks what you want to know. For which territory do you want to know it? For which rights type do you want to know it? For which period of time you want to know it? Those kind of information you need to provide. And then you get the answer. You'll get the same message header structure-wise. Obviously, sender and recipient would be swapped around. There would be a new timestamp and so forth. You get a party list, a work list. Hopefully, the work list will now contain all the writers. The label may only know 3 writers. If the publisher knows that there were actually 5 writers, they will provide all the writers back. The works, resources, and releases can be provided back as well if wanted. And then there is a list of the right shares that somebody owns. So if we're going one level deeper, the request on the left-hand side versus the right share notification on the left-hand side. So the request contains an identifier for the request. If this is an updated request, you want to reference the request that you are now updating. So there's a previous request ID. There is a list of the works that you want to request information about. And then there is a condition, the musical work share request I'll come to in a second. And then there is the condition, which then, as I said, asks about territory, rights type, and those kind of information. The musical work share request is where the request goes to a hub, but you already know or suspect who the publishers are, the hub should forward the request to. That's where you can provide that information. But if you're going directly to a publisher, all you would need to provide is a request ID, the list of works through this request work reference, and the conditions, what you actually want to do with a license or with a work once you have it. And the reply, well, you have a notification ID. Here is my right share notification. If it's an update, you may want to, again, point to an older notification. You certainly want to say, I'm now responding to your to your right share picture request 55. So there's a request ID in there. And then you get all the right shares for all the works that rights controller owns or controls. If they don't own or control something, they will typically not say anything. So you will not get a complete picture necessarily from a publisher. You will only get those right shares that that publisher owns or controls. And if you want to know what's in a right share, well, it's a lot, but it's actually quite straightforward when you look at it. This may be a little bit too small for you to read right now, but we can have a look at it in detail a bit later. You have the usual right share type. Is it a writer share, or is it a collection share, or is it a licensing share? So what type of right share are we dealing with? What are the works that the right share is part of? So which work is this right share is the basis for this right share? Which territory does it apply? Is it mechanical? Is it printing? Is it sync, or is it performing rights? What's the use type? Is there a limitation on whether it's just for download or just for streaming? Is there a commercial model type? So is the right share limited to only pay-as-you-go commercial models, or is it also for subscriptions? Who is the rights controller? Or who's the licensing agent on behalf of that rights controller? Or is the rights controller unknown? Can be communicated. It's kind of rare. What's the validity period? From when to when is that right share active or valid? And then the percentage itself and a couple of other pieces of information. So it's quite comprehensive, but it's also fairly straightforward once you know what a right share represents, and when you're working with those, then you will understand this. That is MWN in a nutshell. It's not complicated in the end, but it does have lots of little nooks and crannies in which you can get lost, I'm afraid. So let's have a look at the MWL message. And that's even simpler, I would argue. The choreography here is really, really simple. There's a direct choreography, can also go through a hub though. The licensee sends a license request to a licensor, and the licensor then sends a license message back, which can also be a revocation. That's it. There is not much more to it. We once had a license cancellation message, but nobody ever cancels licenses, so that is no longer in the standard. So you have license request, license provision. Very important, the licensing standard, the MWL standard, assumes that the licensee has established an accurate share picture, which can be done through MWN, and that's what I would recommend people use, but it doesn't need to be. But it's certainly the case that when you request a license from a publisher, you need to already know the right share. The publisher will not provide you back with all the information that would fill in the information for you. If you need that, you need to use the MWN first, and then you can establish the license using MWL. That, of course, means that it's possible that I'm sending out MWN requests, I'm establishing a right share picture, and then I'm starting to send license requests out, by which time the right share picture may already be obsolete. The standard has means of signaling back to me that that is now not an accurate right share picture anymore, so I would need to go back to the MWN situation and request the share picture before I can then go back to requesting licenses. Theoretically, that can go on perpetually, but I think that's rather academic. The standard also deals with things like compulsory licenses and controlled composition clauses. I mentioned that briefly earlier. The point here is that even though a record company that, for example, has an artist contract with a controlled composition clauses, through which they already have a license to the musical work, if the musician is also the writer of his or her work. At that stage, the label does not need to request a license anymore, but they do need to inform the publisher that they are now making use of that license established through the control composition clause. And the license request message is then used to signal this notification. Hey, I'm using this work under control composition clause. I don't need a license, but I'm letting you know. And the license message that come back then is not actually a license message, but just a confirmation message. However, because the data that you need to communicate in a proper license request or in a notification for a control composition clause, or in the other way, the license or the confirmation for a license is exactly the same. So we use the same message. How does the message look like? Well, it looks like this. And you will see the same party list, the same work list, the same resource list, the same release list, the same write share list we've already talked about. The message header is the same anyway. And then you have the message purpose at the top. That's precisely this flag which says, hey, is this a proper license request, or is it a compulsory license, or is it something that is done under a control composition clause? At the bottom, you have a condition list and then the license request list. These are basically the elements where you say, under what do I want the license for? Do I want it for a download business model, for a ringtone business model? Is it pay as you go? Is it mechanical? All of those bits are being communicated there. And then you get the message back, the license message back, the message purpose. Yep, the same as on the other side. Party list, we already know. Work list, we already know. Write share list, we already know. License list is the only thing that's really new in the license message. And it provides two different bits. One is the license itself, and then there's also the ability to reject a license. A couple of examples. I can make a license request, a proper license request for a specific musical work, for a specific territory or whatever. And if the publisher doesn't want to grant that, they can then reject that license through this message. Typically what happens is that the license terms and conditions have been agreed between licensee and licensor before this message is being sent. So the license request merely states the already agreed license terms, and typically would then get a license that is granted on those terms and conditions. But in some cases, there may still be some discrepancies between the understanding between what the licensee and what the licensor think. In that case, you would typically get a license rejection. A second example is looking about a control composition clause, where in the license request, in the condition, the record company provides evidence that there is a control composition clause in place. So the message allows the inclusion of, for example, the signature page of this artist contract that can be sent over to the publisher, and the publisher can then look at that. But in some cases, they need to do checks about, is the control composition clause was signed earlier than the recording of the music was made, and those kind of things. And if that is not the case, well, then actually the control composition doesn't apply, and you would get a license rejection. Not a license rejection in this case, it's simply saying, hey, by the way, your request for, or your notification of a control composition license use was invalid. Danny is currently asked, or has just asked, how many people are using these standards. it is true that at the moment, the main users of all of these standards that we've talked about are major record companies or large record companies, I would say, and collective management organizations and larger DSPs. We are in the process of rolling it out, if you like, to broader audience or broader user base. When it comes to the territorial spread, the MWL and the LOD standard that I'll come to in a moment, they are more specific to the United States than to other countries. The right share picture standard, that is something that is used much wider, and that can be applied anywhere. That is specifically a worldwide standard, if you like. But MWL and LOD, if you're looking at LOD, which is the next subject, it has the word or the letters US in the title because it's a standard with particular focus on the United States, or the market in the US. So let's have a look at the US. Or one further comment, I would say. I do think that these standards, all three standards, are suitable for wherever you do work by work licenses. They clearly don't work for blanket licenses. You simply do not need them. We have limited, I said that at the very beginning, we limited that to the US because the people in the room when we've developed the standards were all very familiar with how the US process works. So this is the blueprint that we've used for developing these. I'm pretty darn sure that the same process would also work, or the standard itself would also work for other countries' choreographies, wherever, and processes, as long as they use work by work licenses. Danny, if you just drop me a small email, I'll come back to you on that. Might be the easiest way. Where does the publishing information for any given right share originate? Asks Kevin. That's nearly a loaded question. No, it's not a loaded question, but it can be complex. The publisher obtains information about the musical works that they have received from the writers, from the people that they have signed up. A lot of the information originates in the studio, and a lot of the information there is then filtered through various parties, artists, managers, and so forth, before it then reaches the publishers. Some information goes via rights, collective rights management organizations. We have developed, DDEX has developed a separate standard. We call it the RIN, the Recording Information Notification, which is a standard which is increasingly implemented in digital audio workstation systems, either the actual consoles or standalone application that you have on your iPad, for example, which starts to enable the collection of that kind of information. Who owns which, which writer is given how much % of a specific work, so that that information then can be fed into the supply chain, then used by the publishers. The one complication is that, of course, you then go very quickly from those writer shares, as we call them, to original publisher shares, and then the collection shares. So there's a chain of titles that need to be observed in order to establish who has currently the right for a specific share in a specific territory for a specific use type. Now the messages can all communicate that, but that is something that publishers will need to collect, and that's basically their business, isn't it? I hope that helps somewhat. So let's talk about the LOD choreography, where a label or a DSP basically says has a license for a work, and they may use the work. And then the acquiring publisher, as we call them, basically tells the label or the DSP, hey, this is mine now, pay me now. There are sometimes cases where the old publisher, the relinquishing publisher, as we call them, still gets paid for a month or two or something like that, or continues to be paid for old licenses, but now the new publisher deals with new licenses. All those little details can be handled by the message, but the principle is, hey, this is mine now, and the label or the DSP can then basically send a confirmation back and say, yeah, all right, I'll pay you now. They will typically not do that without checking with the relinquishing publisher using LOD, for example, or other means that, yeah, that catalog has actually changed hands. Otherwise, I'll just go and ask Sony Music for the, or Universal Music for the Beatles catalog, and I'll be very rich. They will not get that to me. They will ask ATV first. The acquiring publisher can and should actually obtain all the work information, including where works are being used, from the relinquishing publisher before any LOD happens. This can be done using MWN, the standard we talked about first, or it can be done by any other means. But that's what the LOD choreography does. I can. We're starting to run out of time, so I'm not going to go into the structure of the message unless we want to. I wanted to leave with two closing remarks. One that I wanted to stress once more. These three standards have a common approach, as you have seen. They use the same structure. They use the same composites. The way a right share is described in MWN is the same as how a right share is described in MWL, is the same that a rights share is expressed in LOD. This makes the implementation of this family of standards quite as simple or as straightforward as possible. Of course, you will still need to map a rather rich and complex data structure to your internal systems, but there is no way around that. The business of handling musical works is a complex business. That's why the messages are complex, but they are only complex in that sense. All of these three messages are the same, therefore it's much easier to implement them. And last but not least, I started by saying that DDEX defines three aspects: the choreography, the structure, and the message exchange mechanism. I've talked so far about the first two bits. I haven't talked about the message exchange protocol. Typically, these messages are exchanged with FTP, but the standard also allows them to be exchanged or used with web services. I had planned to look at XSD, and we can still do that. But first, I wanted to see whether there are any further questions at this stage, because we're starting to come to the 55-minute mark. If not, I said earlier that we can have a closer look at the, where are we, notification, at the right share itself. This is not much smaller. because that's so core to the message and the whole choreography. So this is how the right share looks in all of those messages. You have the right share reference, which is something that allows, which is an internal message, internal element that allows pointing to it. So if you have a right share request, you can then point to this right share within the message. That's just if you're familiar with XML, it's an ID ref concept. You then have the right share type, which, as I say, is a licensing share or a collection share or a manuscript share or an original publisher share. You then can provide it. You don't have to, but you can provide an identifier for it. You can then point to the musical work that has been used. So here you have the pointer to the musical work. And in the musical work list, you have the musical work. You will then find the musical work reference. And that allows to list the musical work and then have multiple shares then pointing to the same musical works, for example. To be honest, I don't know what this work related to samples does at the moment, so I'll just graciously jump over it. So for which territory or territories, it's one to many, does the right share apply? Where is it valid? What's the rights type that is used here? Is it a mechanical right? Is it the performing right? Is it a print right? Is it a synchronization right? What's the use type that you want to limit the share to? And again, we have a long list. DDEX has a long list of different use types. The rights type is mandatory. You have to say this is mechanical right or mechanical and sync and so forth. The use type is an optional element. If somebody wants to limit something for a specific use, then that can be expressed. Carrier type, if it's for a specific physical product, and again, DDEX has a fairly long list of potential physical products that you can communicate here. Go away. The commercial model type I talked about. Is it a pay-as-you-go or is it a ad-supported model and so those kind of things. And then here in this block, we have who the rights controller is. The party, it's a rights controller, as I said, is just another party. So you have a pointer to the party list. Who is the rights controller? Who is the licensing agent? And there are attributes here whether that a licensing agent is acting as an owner or whether they're acting just as an agent. Both that can be communicated. So you can say the rights controller is the owner and the licensing agent is an agent to actually signal the specific role of those companies, or you can say that a rights controller is not known. You can have a display name for the rights controller that is important for certain display purposes, hence the name. How the publisher would like to be credited in a musical work, that allows then the record company to provide that, to put that string, I nearly said print that on the back of the sleeve, but provide that then in information in the ERN message to a DSP so that the information is displayed appropriately to consumers. When is it valid? So from when to when is that right share applicable? What's the percentage? Or is it unknown? Or is potentially, and that again talks about the hub model, the hub may need to send back to a record company, I've got a share here for 25%, I've got a share here for 50%, and then there are 25% for which I have not received any claim. In that case, one can provide share not claimed here with rights controller unknown, And at that stage, the record company knows, all right, the hub doesn't have a complete share picture as of yet. There are flags here to signal whether rights are in dispute. Again, that's something that the hub uses to signal that they have received more than 100% of claims from different publishers. And the last two, because I'm now starting to run out of time, the last 2 points here allow you to tie back the collection share to the writer share, as well as all the collection shares that once were in the past. So when something was sold from one publisher to another publisher to another publisher, you can then provide basically the entire chain if that is what is required. So that is all that I have had. Kevin has another question. Identifying publishers for the purpose of submitting a license request is still an open problem. Yes. There is no central database that I know of that contains all the publishers for all the works. HFA can help, certainly. Centralized systems. The MLC certainly will be able to help in some extent to this, but this is something that these standards do not solve, not on their own. Are there any other questions? If not, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.